Welcome to Arrested DevOps, episode 31, Docker. I'm your co-host, Matt Stratton, at Matt Stratton on Twitter.
And I'm your co-host, Bridget Krumhout, at Bridget Krumhout on Twitter.
Arrested DevOps is brought to you by 10th Magnitude, a cloud services company that figures if you're listening to this podcast, then you must be pretty cool. You can find out about joining their cloud services team at 10thmagnitude.com.
We all know that being on call sucks, but what if there was a tool out there that allowed you to route incidents to the right team, mention specific people to ask for help, and hop into chat with your team from an easy-to-decipher incident timeline that gave you full context of what was happening? That tool is VictorOps, and they're different. From setting up global on-call rotations to creating a postmortem report, VictorOps is there with you through every step of the incident lifecycle. Their real-time collaboration platform helps your team to solve problems faster. Sign up for a 14-day free trial to see how they're making on-call suck less. Visit arresteddevops.com/VictorOps to sign up.
This episode is also brought to you by Datadog, a monitoring service for scaling cloud infrastructures that brings together data from servers, databases, apps, and other tools. Datadog monitors your Docker container's performance and correlates these metrics with the performance of the underlying infrastructure and the applications running inside. Check it out with a 14-day free trial at arresteddevops.com/Datadog31.
If you're listening to / watching this live, please feel free to share your questions and comments on Twitter at ArrestedDevOps or on IRC, freenode.org, channel Arrested DevOps. So joining us here today to talk about Docker is James Turnbull, VP of Engineering at Kickstarter. James, thank you for joining us. Can you give us a bit of background on yourself and your interest in this Docker stuff?
Sure. So I've been in engineering and operations for about, quite a few years, more than I care to think about. Over the years, I've seen a lot of sort of containerization solutions. Docker's obviously not a new thing. But when I saw them open source the Docker product, Solomon Hykes gave a talk at PyCon that was really awesome. And I was finally like, my God, this is actually a solution that's built by people to be usable by people, as opposed to some of the previous containerized solutions, which were built by engineers to be usable by a very small subset of other engineers. So I recognized pretty early on that I thought Docker was going to be sort of a pretty big change in the way people were going to do things and had the potential to sort of facilitate a bunch of DevOps-y-like stuff.
Well, we are all about DevOps-y-like stuff here. So you have listed in your lower third, Kickstarter, Docker. I know that you did work at Docker. Can you talk a little bit about what this Docker advisor role means? Like, what is your ongoing involvement with the project?
Sure. My initial involvement with the project was obviously I was involved in the open source side of things. I wrote a book about Docker, and eventually I worked at Docker, running the services and support side of things, basically building the customer-facing business. Unfortunately, Docker's in San Francisco and I'm in New York, and a startup at that sort of stage requires a lot of sort of on-the-ground presence in the office. So I was on an aeroplane quite a lot. I was also doing a lot of evangelism and going to conferences and talking about Docker and going to meet customers and things like that. So I spent a frightening number of nights in hotels last year. It's something approaching 180 to 100 nights. Needless to say, my wife and my friends were like, do you live here in New York anymore, or do you live in airport lounges? And when you start to recognize the airport lounge staff and the flight attendants on the New York-San Francisco route, I start to recognize you. You realize that it might be time for a bit of a break. So I parted company with the Docker guys and stepped back and took a more advisory role, which is really around, I provide a bunch of advice around the open source project and the governance there, around the business and the roadmap and a bunch of other areas like that.
Great, awesome. So you mentioned the Docker book. I know that you keep writing books, and you say that R.B. Brown puts up with this, which is a good thing. But can you tell us a little bit about what led you to write a Docker book specifically? And like, I have it, I've read it, I know what parts I find the most useful. But can you tell me, like, what were your favorite parts to really write, to dig in and write a book about?
Sure. I think the big thing for me around Docker was that when I first looked at it, it was was much easier to use than a lot of other tools out there, but it was an entirely new technology to a lot of people, particularly to a lot of developers. It feels very infrastructure-y to developers. It feels very sysadmin-y. So I wanted to write something that would sort of allow people of varying, a very introductory book that allow people of varying skill levels to sort of be able to understand really quickly, what is Docker, what is the value I get out of it, and how do I use it, and here's some useful things. So it's very much a practical book. So it actually focused on things like, I would like to test an application, or I would like to build a service, or I would like to use Docker with Jenkins, things that a typical developer or sysadmin would do. And those are probably my favorite chapters, chapters 5 and 6, which sort of talk about Docker as a testing tool and Docker as a production services implementation, and touches on sort of continuous delivery, continuous integration, and touches a bit on things like microservices and different architectures, which was really exciting to me because it sort of allowed people to sort of see this is what this might look like in production.
Yeah, and so here's the million-dollar question: are you using Docker in production at Kickstarter?
We are. We've actually been using it longer than I've worked here. So one of my colleagues implemented it. We actually, one of the things that's really interesting about our environment is that everybody basically has a replica of the Kickstarter environment locally on the laptops. So we do local development there, and that's a heavily Dockerized solution. At some point in time, we'll probably look at doing some more Docker stuff in production. We're a big AWS user, so there's things like ECS that are interesting, and I think from our point of view, it presents some sort of useful scalability sort of advantages.
Yeah, cool.
So,
I mean, that's actually, and I know Matt has some questions for you about that, but I got to say that's what you just described is some of why we find Docker really useful at where I work at Drama Fever too. Just the ability for the devs to have production on their laptop is really powerful. It's like, here's the exact container that's running in production, and go.
Yep.
which is a thing I wanted to kind of get a little. I wanted to kind of bring back a little bit because as I kind of joked, I said this is going to be the episode where Matt sits around and has no idea what James and Bridget are talking about. So I'm representing the people that aren't as experienced with Docker or kind of work around it. Or I don't mean around it, but I mean like it's part of our ecosystem. Not like I try to get around it like as this thing that gets in my way. But I want to understand. So one of the things that I kind of think about when I is to me, and to tell me if this is an accurate statement, because this is a thought I have, is that if you're talking the same thing like with PaaS, right? Like I remember going through this with on the Azure PaaS side, which was nobody wanted to rewrite their applications to be cloud native, but new stuff they would do that way. Is that kind of a true statement when we think about containerization, is that if you're talking about true microservice, if you're talking about something that's built for that type of a role, do you get more bang for your buck versus trying to take something that's a more traditional application and saying, well, sure, that's great that I can have a copy of everything on dev, which I think is awesome. I mean, I love config management for that reason, right? I love the idea of a local VM that looks just like prod. But is that do you get that utilization? And Bridget, I'd like to know, like in your experience too, where you're doing that, are you talking about applications that were designed to be used in this manner, or are you taking applications that weren't designed to be used in that manner and being able to let Docker make them easier? That was a lot of questions. Pick any of them.
Bridget, I'm happy for you to jump in first if you like.
Okay. So we are a startup that's been around for 5 years, and we have a giant monolithic Django Python app. And then we added a whole bunch of Go microservices later. While the Go microservices are, of course, easier to Dockerize, we do have the Django app in Docker. Like, we did move it into containers before I got there. This happened in, like, October 2013, I think. So I'm pretty sure that's about, maybe James knows, but I think that's when Docker's website pretty much just had, like, giant letters in blink that said, do not use this in production.
It was probably October 2013. Did you say?
Yeah.
That'd probably be those letters didn't actually come down until mid 2014 when at Docker, the first DockerCon, where we actually, the night before we launched 1.0, I removed all references to the word don't use in production and redeployed. So, yeah.
Yeah. So we did migrate a pre-existing app into Docker. From what I understand from my coworkers, Tim and Paul, who did it, who were there at the time, it was not without its challenges to Dockerize. But yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly not impossible. Like, you don't have to just be greenfielding in order to use Docker. James, what is your experience on this?
I think that's one of the really interesting things about Docker is that the Docker file is incredibly simple to build. And yeah, obviously microservices Docker lends itself to microservices really strongly, but it's not the only architecture you want to use. I think there's a lot of brownfields apps that have ended up in Docker because it is inherently so easy. And it's very easy to integrate with configuration management, so you've already got those things with Chef cookbooks or Puppet modules, then it's very easy to use those to build Docker images. Same with tools like Packer and things like that, and Vagrant, they integrate with Docker as well. So if you've got a bunch of existing infrastructure, it's relatively easy to introspect that and create Docker images from them. And the very fact that it tends to be sort of focused on that build, dev, test workflow means that there's a lot less I guess there's a lot less cycle time in building some of that stuff that you look at. Let's say you wanted to replicate the production environment in a test cluster in your sort of data center or locally, something like that. That's probably a non-trivial exercise. Whereas sort of building up a Docker image, you can do that sort of relatively quickly. You don't need to buy 10 new test servers or you can actually sort of play around with that in a much faster than you would otherwise be able to.
And especially if you get into some of the orchestration tools that you cover in your book, like Fig, for example. Some of our devs have started using that, and we're finding that it's pretty helpful to drop a fig.yaml file in any given repo and then say, hey, this is how you fig up the stuff you need to actually test this project.
Yeah, I think multi-tier, obviously multi-tier apps are something that Docker is as yet not awesome at, and Fig makes a lot of that, which is, Fig's about to be renamed to Compose, I believe. But I think Fig makes that a lot easier, and it allows you to do something like, a sysadmin or an operations person can create a Fig YAML file that contains my Rails container, my Nginx front-end container, or my Unicorn container, a database container and a Redis container, and basically hook them together, create all of the links between them. A dev runs one command and gets a functioning version of of their application that they can work from on their laptop locally. I sometimes think that people forget how hard this is to do, and how before Docker started talking about, people sort of, they kind of forget the past, and they go, oh my god, Docker's a pain in the ass to use. And I'm like, compared to what exactly? Compared to your previous build, or compared to you shipping around 10 ISO files and running Vagrant and 20 VirtualBox VMs on your local machine? That's a non-trivial thing to set up. And I'm sort of I think the phrase is the phrase I use every now and again is I think people protest us too much because it's a thing, as opposed to remembering the fact that it wasn't that long ago that the dark ages were real. I'm not suggesting that Docker's a panacea, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's definitely been our experience. I actually joined Drama Fever right when we were in the process of, and this is probably backwards, maybe, I don't know, but we had actually gone to production with Docker and had Docker on the shared dev QA environments in EC2. And then last summer, right about, I think when James was editing the website to say it's okay to use it in production now, at that point we were starting to get all of the devs to actually use boot to Docker. And so I came in during that part, and it was actually really it was fun, and it was a great learning experience for me. And it was also, it basically showed me that having the devs have the ability to grab the containers, that it's not, is this sort of like, did this get, was head at the right place, did this get checked out, now am I loading the right fixtures? My Vagrant box maybe not be exactly like what's in QA right now. What is in QA right now? And it's like, now you can just grab the container image for what you want, start the container you want, and you're looking at the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important step forward, and I think that the fact that Docker does smooth the edges around all of those little subtle differences, like fixtures and versions of gems or pips or whatever it happens to be, you can't underestimate how much time engineers spend actually troubleshooting shit like that. I fairly regularly have conversations with engineers who go, I lost 3 hours of time because my local machine bundler is stuffed on my local machine, or RVM is broken, or RVM is broken. And those of you familiar with the Ruby world know that's not an uncommon occurrence. And when it happens, it's a pain in the ass to fix.
Yeah, that kind of ability to just sort of instantiate, however that's done, I think is again, whatever the mechanism is, like you said, the dark ages weren't that long ago, and I think I just not, I make a similar statement when I talk about just having to do with not changing something, but talking about how quickly these things are changing and why we have to think about that is when I'm telling people about the testing tools we have around configuration management. I'm like, hey, in the olden days of a year ago, here's how we tested chef cookbooks, right?
Yeah.
And it's
do you remember the time before Test Kitchen? All of 2.5.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, and then, so
yes, every day now I say thank you, Fletcher.
Yeah, that's how I'm fond of saying, not a day goes by that my life isn't made better by something Fletcher because of Fletcher. Now, maybe him introducing me to replygift.net, but or it could be Test Kitchen.
So we had a question from IRC. Someone named Tom Fooey says, "Do you have databases in Docker in production?" And I let him know that at Drama Fever we use RDS for what we have in the MySQL container for the dev environment, or for the local environment. Like actually in dev, QA, and prod, we just are pointed at RDS. But James, in your experience, do people use databases inside Docker in production?
So we have, on local machines, we also use RDS for production and staging, but our local development instances point to MySQL running in Docker. Same with Elasticsearch. So that's one of the things we Dockerized really early because it is a little bit of a fiddly thing to build. Right version of the JVM, right version of Elasticsearch, prepping all the data and all that sort of stuff. So those sort of things are a natural fit, I think, for a lot of environments.
Yeah, I guess actually our Elasticsearch is Dockerized as well. I hadn't really considered that in the scope of this question in terms of quote-unquote production, just because it's not in our request path.
Yeah, and Redis as well, all of that sort of stuff that anything that we sort of think about that could be easily self-contained. And sometimes, we're not necessarily, like in the case of dev environments, I don't have to worry about the continuity of the data all that much. Like if I lose the MySQL container with a replica, with my sanitized production replica in it, I'm like, I'll rebuild another one. Obviously, I'm not necessarily sure I'd feel the same way in production, but that's why we use RDS. So,
well, and something about the data in dev that is actually kind of valuable for us is we actually, James alluded to talking about using Jenkins in conjunction with Docker and in his book. And like at Drama Fever, one of the things we do is we actually build all of the images. We build all the images and push them to our private registry on Jenkins. So we build the MySQL container and load in, load in all the fixtures that we want people to be able to use for their tests. So they can pull down a container that actually literally has everything they need for the website to, at least in kind of a limited fashion work.
I think for continuous integration, I cannot emphasize as much. People should definitely look at Docker because you're dealing with execution environments that live for a very short period of time, usually while the tests are run. Often the tests are destructive, or they're likely to leave the data in an unclean state, or a state where you have to rebuild. I think Docker, just in terms of its startup speed and its build time, is a sensational combination for continuous integration. Absolutely sensational. We've seen people cut their build times in half.
Yeah, it's really the thing that takes the longest for us is running the tests, but getting the actual container doing everything we want it to do is way faster.
That's just it. I mean, let's say it takes you 30 minutes to run your tests, and 10 minutes of that, or even 5 minutes of that, is build and execution on a virtual machine. Taking it down to 25 minutes from 30 minutes over, and if you're doing continuous deployment and you're trying to deploy more than multiple times a day, those 5 minutes add up pretty quickly.
Exactly, 100%. So when you're talking, and you said that you did go and travel a bunch, and I saw you at a few conferences last year talking about some of this stuff, and it seems like recently on the internets or whatever, the discussions around Docker and its ecosystem and the environment around it have kind of heated up. Like, how do you find yourself reacting to some of the controversy? Ooh.
I guess it's not such a. Having lived with it for a long time, it's not such a shock to me. Like, there's always going to be people for whom hypey things are hypey. And I don't blame some people. There are certainly journalists out there who have simplified Docker to being like, this is a revolutionary technology that will cure world hunger. I'm fond of saying that Docker is a powerful tool to help you in your sort of in your development lifecycle. If you want to get code off developers' laptops or out of repos into production as fast as possible, it's one of the best tools that's ever been developed for that. It's not a panacea though. It won't. Not every workload in your data center is well suited to Docker right now. Certainly, it certainly lends itself better to more immutable or to high performance computing, or to things that are sort of more sort of mini node like. If you've got Hadoop or you're doing sort of data analysis or anything that involves jobs or anything like that, Docker, it's like a natural fit. But if you're running Oracle, as a backend for SAP, I'm not sure yet that Docker is your ideal solution.
I would agree. I don't think Docker is for everything. Like, we had right before I started at Drama Fever, we had a serious let's Dockerize all the things project, and some of the things that we Dockerized, like our Graphite server, I'm not convinced it's benefiting from being Dockerized.
I've had people who want to say, well, can I run Chef Server in a container? And I kind of say, I'm sure you could, but I don't understand why.
Yeah. I look at Graphite as a really interesting example of this. So, I would probably run Carbon Relay and Carbon Cache inside Docker containers, but I'd probably point them at a physical machine with SSD disk in it to actually burn the Whisper or burn the metrics down to. But I can easily do things like, I want to add a 10 new Carbon relays. I can do that really quickly with Docker, and very simply. That makes that sort of scalable, ease of use stuff really simple, but it takes consideration of the fact that, okay, maybe Docker isn't the best way to write out transactional real-time metrics to a file system. I don't know. I've never performance tested it, but I would suggest that you need to look at each implementation and say, where does Docker fit here? Are we actually gaining stuff? Are we gaining stuff? Okay, we are. We should Dockerize that, and we should leave the bits that don't need to be Dockerized either until Docker has improved its capabilities in that area, or not at all. It's the same. It's like you use the tool that's best for the job, rather than sort of go, all of the tools need to look the same.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're now to a point with our Docker use, that we're re-examining it and figuring out where we can make improvements, like much smaller images, say for the Go applications that we're shipping that have very few dependencies. Hey, we got it down to a 10 meg container, or rather a 10 meg container image. Excellent.
Yeah.
It makes for pulling the image, and when stuff auto scales a lot faster. So there's places like that where we're kind of iterating towards improvements, but then there's also places where we're kind of looking and going, do we really, as we refactor this, that, or the other, maybe Docker isn't the right solution for absolutely everything, and that's okay.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people respond to stuff like that and they go, I don't like that because someone has made a sweeping generalization. Personally, I don't base my technical architecture and my product decisions based on what tech journalists write, or even what excitable people write in a 2-paragraph blog post about Docker Wookie or World Hunger. I make them based on I try a bunch of products out, I look at a bunch of architectures, I do some testing, I collect some data, and then I make a decision. If your immediate response to something is I haters, I'm sort of skeptical about those sort of responses. It means someone basically hasn't put a lot of thought into whether Docker is a fit or not, and what Docker's strengths and weaknesses are. And also, people don't like popular things. I think there is a certain backlash against things that are, in Australia we call it the tall poppy syndrome. Like the flower that climbs above the rest of the other flowers. The first one that gets chopped down. I think there's probably an American equivalent of that phrase.
We would say it's being a hipster, right? It's like, oh man, I used Docker before it was cool, so screw that.
Hey, I resemble that remark.
Yeah, exactly, right? So.
Does it count as a hipster if one of the reasons you decide to work at a place is because they're using Docker in production and it's mid-2014 and you're like, this is a kind of fun, cool idea?
I actually think that's, if we kind of think about it, we'll probably talk about this in our next episode, which is going to be about starting a new DevOps job, about why you decide to work where you do, and I think that things like that could totally be really legit reasons in moderation. You got to kind of think about, nothing in particular about Docker, but if you're like, wow, you're using super cutting edge stuff, and
yep,
and you're taking crazy risks. If you're okay with that, that's okay. Anyway.
What it really says to me is that they're not afraid to try things.
Right. I'm saying it's the level of the cut of the risk. I'm saying, if it was something, I was trying to think of something clever, and it didn't happen. I will cut that part out of the audio because I'm being not funny. And being funny is the only thing I'm able to possibly contribute to this episode. So
actually, no, that's not true, because you read the thing on Reddit that I didn't want to read because I thought it was going to do bad things to my blood pressure.
Also, that blog post. Okay.
Well, it's not even so much the blog post, but
Matt read it. Matt found some information in there that he did want to talk about. So, Matt.
Yeah. So to give a little bit of background, and I'll put the links to this in the show notes to take a look at it. So there was a post that was linked to in the r sysadmin subreddit, and the post is called "Docker is fundamentally flawed." Useless hype. Or actually, I think the post is actually called "Revisiting Docker Again." And
I think the author made an original blog post some months beforehand where he looked at maybe Docker 1.0 or something like that, and he was now looking at it again.
This was his revisiting, which and the thing was, I will say this, that kind of looking at the writer, the author's comments much later in the thread, it was still very contentious, but kind of was doing a little backpedaling about hey, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a tech expert, I'm just saying my thing. But it was fairly inflammatory. But that being said, what I was more interested in, because I don't have the chops to even really comprehend whether or not it was valid or not, was there's this long flame war thread where people get all angry but I kind of was picking through it and saying, well, when I take away some of the flaminess and FUD and all this stuff that is so popular in that subreddit, there were two things that I said, hey, as someone who doesn't really know this, these sound like legitimate questions in terms of I'm actually curious. So I would like to pose them
to
y'all and get your thoughts. And so this first one, and I'm going to quote directly from the user, and it's his user is A-KO. It says that, so this person's opinion, it says, Docker is a DevOps solution to an operational systems problem. It's a solution to a problem from a developer's point of view, and someone that has little to no experience with the OS platforms they're running on Docker provides no security benefits at all. What it provides is an operational and developer benefit, but it makes security 100 times worse. So
Okay.
it's a big thing. The thing about that, like to unpack it, the two pieces. One is there's this belief, and again, it's the sysadmin subreddit. So of course they hate all developers, right? So Docker is a dev tool, like whatever, blah blah blah. So I'd like your thoughts on that, and then also this security implication.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that when I looked at that blog post, the thing that struck me most about it was that it was it lacked a lot of empathy for those people that actually have to use technology. And this is something I get very strident about. I've been on both sides of the fence, and I'm a notoriously terrible developer, but I have worn that hat. I've been a sysadmin, I've been a security person, I've been a CTO and a VP of engineering and an ops manager and a bunch of other things. So I consider myself somewhat of a jack of all trades. And I think one of the reasons, if I can be a little bit, one of the reasons I think I've been reasonably successful at what I do is that I have empathy for other people's problems. And a lot of sysadmins, you pointed it out, you actually sort of hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of sysadmins in our sysadmin that hate developers. And I think that's true of a certain subset of the operations and sysadmin community. Their basic developers are really annoying. They want things, they want test environments, they ship you code that doesn't work. That when something breaks, they're not the ones that get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. They're cowboys. They're always writing new things with no conception of how production works, all that sort of thing. And I look at that, and the first thing that strikes me about that is have you thought about what's going on in their world and why they're doing that? And the second thing is that you do realize that your job doesn't exist without them. And for a lot of sysadmins, you don't manage infrastructure that sits there and is infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. You have two customers. One is the business, and by extension, their customers, and the other is the people internal to the company that rely on the infrastructure, who are people like DBAs and developers, business analysts. All of those people pay your salaries. And I find it galling, if not outright, sort of makes me very, very angry, let's put it that way, when I hear sysadmins basically lack that empathy entirely for the people that they effectively their customers. They don't ask themselves, why do developers end up shipping me this code that doesn't work in production, or why do they build these things that don't fit our security model, or can't be backed up, or don't fit into our logging environment? And hence we are on a DevOps blog post. The most logical reason for that is they have no fucking idea what production looks like. And why don't they have any idea? Because there's this grumpy arsehole who manages production, and they're terrified to go and ask them a question.
Yeah, I used to be that grumpy asshole.
Yeah.
It's so much better when the devs are not afraid to talk to you.
Correct.
It makes me much happier. As the former grumpy asshole, it makes me much happier when the devs are willing to talk to me.
And it makes the whole environment more productive because they stop doing things like shipping things that don't match the production architecture and that don't, make assumptions about libraries and versions and operating systems and connectivity and security and all that sort of stuff. So, I guess I look at this in response to go, well, this is a developer solution to an operational problem. And I go, so you're complaining because the people that you have tortured and or ignored who actually provide the code that runs on your infrastructure and makes your company money have decided to solve this particular problem with or without you. Surely you want to get on this bandwagon before someone pushes you off the building or out of the building and replaces you.
Yeah.
And the other irony I find particularly amusing is that Solomon Hykes, who was the original architect of Docker, comes from such a strong operational background. He's a developer for sure, but he actually ran a PaaS. He was the CTO of the ultimate in infrastructure companies.
Without getting into whatever thing, but I think we're fairly aware that there's this perception as well that Chef is for devs, and that makes me laugh all the time. For anybody who knows Adam Jacob or knows probably 90% of the people that work at Chef, we're not, even the devs are not dev, right? So many of these things are, like you said, they're built by sysadmins and who get it, right? And that just gets missed. We ran into this with our episode we did with Jeffrey Snover, the guy who created PowerShell, and I'm seeing people being like, "Oh, here's some marketing guy," and blah blah blah, and I'm like, "Do you guys not understand that like this thing you do that you love, like this guy created it, and because he's done your job." So, yeah. Anyway.
And also on that security aspect, like. We don't worry about, containing things inside the container for security's sake because, at least in our implementation of Docker in production, in our request path, on our production servers, we are securing the actual host instance that the, containers are running on, and we're not trying to protect the containers from each other. Like, I don't know that I would use, were I running something like DigitalOcean, I don't know that I would use Docker to separate customers from each other, but that's not the use case that at least we have.
Well, and it's not something Docker has ever claimed. So I didn't answer this. I got a bit ranty, and I apologize. But that security question is really interesting. So if you look at the Docker recommendations for this, we basically say you should run applications of like security risk together on Docker containers. You shouldn't use Docker containers as security containers. Mm-hmm. That they are not virtual machines. And then again, for that matter, virtual machines in a lot of cases, if you run PCI DSS, you shouldn't share PCI DSS applications on the same virtual machine cluster, despite them being far more hardened edges than say, a Docker container is. So we make a series of recommendations about like risk profile applications or like security-zoned applications being run together. We strongly recommend use things like SE Linux and AppArmor. And as Bridget highlighted, we strongly recommend you secure the host that it's running on. And that's the level of protection you look at.
So I think that, yeah, okay, awesome. I think that actually pretty much answers the second point, which was to say, username StrangeWill said, "I wonder how various compliance regulations view this idea of run one role per server with containers with elevation exploits, so that I could see them arguing the separation between containers isn't as clear-cut as between VMs and a Type 1 hypervisor," and that's exactly what you just said. Yep. It's not. So don't treat it like that. So that kind of addresses that, right? Which is it's not a hypervisor.
And to be honest,
so I think that's probably just like I said, some of these were the things that made sense to me. I'm like, oh, that's a good question. Yeah. To then be told, rightly so, well, no, that's not what you should do. I'm like, oh, okay.
But it's good that you brought those up because I think those are some of the things people get concerned about.
Oh, yeah. That's what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily expecting that these are like, this is why Docker bad, but it's helping to educate, against making
race conditions with device mapper is why Docker bad.
Yeah. But the really interesting thing about security and compliance is that you ask half a dozen of these people who have an opinion about security and compliance, how many of them actually read any security guidelines or any of the compliance things. I would challenge anyone in that thread to actually tell me if they've read the PCI DSS standards. Now, I have repeatedly because I was a security guy in a bank. I guarantee you 90% of the people I talk to who say PCI DSS needs to do X have never actually implemented PCI DSS and have no idea that X is actually a very low bar. And if you followed simply the regulations, the compliance stuff that related to things like PCI DSS, you would be running a massively insecure system.
Yeah. Yeah. And likewise, I think what we run into is this understanding of what I need to do for compliance is what I've been told to do.
Correct. Yeah.
And outcomes. This happened. We did one of our older episodes. So restofdevops.com/6, our MythBusters episode. You can hear Sasha Bates go all crazy about it. I can't do DevOps.
I must watch that.
It's like, oh, can I answer this one? And it's totally true. So
here, now that we've asked you about some of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt out there, talk to us about the open container spec stuff, Rocket, like anything else in the ecosystem. Is any of that does any of that mean that the sky is falling or has already fallen, or maybe people should be paralyzed by indecision now because nobody has any idea what's going on at this point? Like, what kind of recommendations would you make around that?
So I'm going to probably say a few reasonably controversial things. Advance to the so my view of Rocket is that CoreOS need to create a market and an ecosystem, and the way to do that is to own the standard. Obviously, they identified very quickly that if Docker owned the standard, then Docker would own the ecosystem around the standard, and they may not necessarily build all the tools, but they would hold even with the very loose governance model that Docker has, they would at least be somewhat of a gatekeeper around that ecosystem, and they'd certainly gain all the buzz and the marketing as they have around that ecosystem. So what's the way to try and build your own buzz and your own sort of ecosystem around that was you release a bunch of standards, or you publish an alternative standard. I personally think the CoreOS guys left it a little bit too late. I think that the run that Docker got before that, even though there were there's some issues around how transparent some of the early development around standards was. But broadly speaking, I think they left their run too late. I would be very surprised if they get a lot of traction around Rocket, just because momentum, even if it's a better technical solution, I see and I'm definitely going to be showing my age here, Betamax versus VHS. Betamax, far more elegant technical solution. Did it win? No. So I'm not sure if there's a millennial equivalent, maybe Blu-ray and DVD or something. I don't know. But Laserdisc, I don't know, maybe even.
There has to be a lot because that comparison gets made all the time.
Yeah.
So there must be other things. I feel like we always do this. We say it a lot. We're always saying it's like Betamax and VHS, but I don't remember what any of those things are that we're comparing it to.
Yeah. So I think I'm not particularly. If I was the Docker team, I wouldn't be particularly worried. I think Solomon's kind of, and in his defense, he's very passionate about this space, so he does get a little bit worked up on occasion. But rightfully so, he effectively built this whole hype or not, he built this whole thing. You can say he's standing on the shoulders of some giants, but he did actually push all this stuff out. And I think he's rightfully hurt that people are not sort of, collaborating on something. And it's not even the business stuff to him, which, Solomon's a pretty smart guy, but at his heart is an open source sort of guy. And I think he's kind of hurt that people didn't want to collaborate on stuff and they wanted to build an alternative. He's also really open to taking criticism about Docker. He just hates criticism that comes in the form of nobody providing solutions or answers or coming up with alternatives, or coming up with alternatives that don't involve sort of collaboration.
All right, so when I feel ranty about device mapper and race conditions, I should submit some pull requests.
You should talk to Michael Crosby. No, I mean, Michael Crosby is currently somewhere in San Francisco going, that motherfucker.
Bridget, I think you need to change your Twitter handle to device mapper and race conditions. Yeah.
Unlike some of us in this Google Hangout, I don't change my name on Twitter every week.
That's what's
I didn't even know you could do that until recently, so that's how.
It's really aggravating. Please don't.
Yeah. Especially for people who get email notifications of things. Like I have a friend who doesn't follow a whole lot of people on Twitter. Enough where so to her, like when someone replies her, she gets an email, and so she gets this email and she's like, "Who is DevOps Time Lord?" Or the rest was like DevOps Force Push Hugs, or whatever. And she's like, "What?" I'm like, whatever. So here's something that's interesting to me, and James, I don't know what we can kind of think about this philosophically or technically, but looking at how people like Amazon and Microsoft, the way that they're embracing Docker and providing it from a service perspective, and in both kind of, and those are I think two different kinds of questions. I think there's one big question, which is hey, Amazon, Azure saying Docker's a thing. We want you to be able to Dockerize natively, but then also thinking about Microsoft's embracement of Docker in the first place, and kind of your thoughts and feels around these things.
Sure. I hearkened earlier to the sort of concept of getting code off laptops and out of repos and onto production infrastructure. If you're Amazon and Microsoft, but certainly in the AWS and the Azure space, every one of those pushes is more money, right? So every time you get more of that code and faster onto more machines is revenue. So Docker, if it facilitates that, both in the case of Amazon and Microsoft is like, certainly the cloud services side of Microsoft anyway, they look at that as really attractive. And if you look at some of Azure's considerable success in the Microsoft, more traditional Microsoft space, it's their integration with things like developer tools that have actually allowed them to become so heavily embedded in the Microsoft landscape. It's like if you're in, if you're in, I can't remember what the bloody thing's called, Virtual Source Safe or whatever the developer, I can't remember what it's called now. The developer front end for Microsoft is called
Visual Studio.
Visual Studio, that's it. I keep thinking VS. I knew it was VS something. Visual Studio. One of the things about that is you can click a drop down, add your Azure credentials, and deploy your application from the Visual Studio. That's got to be driving revenue towards Azure because that's incredibly easy, right? And if you're a developer with no infrastructure skills whatsoever, and you can just go click button, launch application in cloud, make available to customers, that's really attractive. So if you can do the same thing with Linux-based tools, and to expand some of that market out as well, the Azure guys have got to be thinking, that's a good idea. AWS feels the same way. AWS's initial customers were heavily developer-oriented. Like if you did not have operational people, Amazon was a very attractive offering because it sort of removed some of that. Someone else manages up to the data center layer, and sometimes even a bit forward with an AMI, manages a lot of the operating system level stuff. So Docker enables those people to get more workloads faster. It's pretty attractive. And I think, so go on.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, these guys are smart business people, right? They're not going to ignore an opportunity like that. And a lot of people have said, they're just, because it's just market hype, they want to integrate. And I'm like, no, they've actually got genuine business reasons for doing this. And you need to think very carefully through their business models to understand what those reasons are. And it's not, it's pretty transparent. Werner, sort of fairly recently, has sort of said this. Listen to people like Adrian Cockcroft and people like that. You'll get some insight into exactly why the public cloud players think Docker is extremely attractive. And Microsoft, more broadly, sees the same thing at the desktop level. They're trying to enhance that market share.
This came up, that was one of the things that Jeffrey Snover said at our last episode with the whole, Microsoft loves Linux, and people are like, oh, is it real? And he said, in the context of Azure, he says, we make more money if you run 10 instances of Linux on Azure than if you run 4 instances of Windows.
Yep.
So they're like, we'll meet you where you are, yep. And then I guess to me, thinking about from a pricing perspective, I guess this is kind of the thing too, is, does this help not keep people from taking advantage of, but if you're like, I guess it's sort of like, what's the model? And I guess the model is, again, at the end of the day, you're selling compute. You don't really care how it's sliced and diced if you're Amazon or whomever. So you're like, hey, you want to have a whole bunch of containers, you want to have a host, you want to have a whatever, it doesn't care. It's a certain amount of compute time, a certain amount of CPU, a certain amount of RAM, a certain amount whatever, but it's all here.
And every tool that drives you into the ecosystem, like Amazon is really good. I describe Amazon as a walled garden.
Yeah.
There are some pretty flowers inside the walled garden. You wander into the walled garden, the door closes behind you, and you go, I can smell the pretty flowers. And a bit later on, you go, some of these flowers are pretty pricey, and you realize you can't find the door, and when you do, it's locked. It's an awesome business model. So anything that drives developers towards that walled garden, and then keeps them there. If you're an Amazon product manager, sell that offering. Nice.
Okay, so last question for you, James, before we move into talking about community stuff and some of our checkouts and whatnot, is it seems like you've done a lot of thinking in this space, unsurprisingly, and it makes me think of like that whole Wayne Gretzky thing, like skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. Like if you were giving people advice, possibly people who are listening to this podcast, if you're giving advice right now as to what people should be paying attention to, what people should be using or doing or giving a shit about in this container space, like right now, where is the puck going to be?
Sure. So I think you can ignore all infrastructure stuff. It's kind of boring anyway, and it's only been a bit, there's been a bit of, how it talks to systemd and device mapper and AUFS and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of meaningless. What I would be looking at is the orchestration and application management capabilities. I'd be looking at the people who are building integrated SDN solutions, software-defined networking, that is, and also software-defined data centers. All of those people who are building that sort of stuff out of Docker components. I'm not particular. I'm not hugely positive on things like PaaS and OpenStack and Cloud Foundry and stuff like that. I think all of those things are kind of failed. Well, I would say failed. They're not particularly interesting to me as a technology. But I look at things like Docker Compose, which is the renamed Fig, the stuff that's going to come out that's being called Docker Swarm, which is all of the sort of clustering technology, people who are building networking things and routers and switches and software-defined things with Docker, and people who are moving up the stack to manage manage different levels of abstraction. That's where things start to get really interesting, because that's one of the areas where configuration management is also heading. Like if you're a chef or a puppet, then you're clearly looking at managing up the stack towards applications. Mm-hmm. Docker's clearly doing the same thing. If you're a developer and you can now, instead of having to run that PaaS or that OpenStack, you can take Fig version 3 or Fig version 4 that just automatically runs you a complex stack, both locally in development and then the same complex stack in production. That's a really attractive offering. Like, that's a really interesting sort of part. Like, I can stop worrying about this clustering stuff, or I don't have to pay as much attention to it as I did in the past, or I don't have to rely on hugely brilliant engineers to build me this thing. It now becomes a black box commodity service for me.
And
that's interesting.
You make a really good point too, which is that it's not like anyone has, their data center with Docker and only Docker, and that's the only thing that they use, and that solves all of their problems, because that would be probably sort of ludicrous. And like when I think of things that we've actually recently introduced to an ecosystem that already had Docker, we've started using Chef, we've started using Packer. Like, we have specific use cases that those things are incredibly helpful to us for. So it's kind of like, it's important to remember just what you said. It's like, there's not one answer that solves all your problems, but this is a direction that is super useful.
And the other interesting aspect there is that people forget that there's no secret sauce in this stuff, right? Everyone running Nginx and Apache and MySQL is probably running it 80% of the same way as everyone else. I challenge you to find a MySQL, a LAMP stack site where 85%, 90% of the configuration files are absolutely identical. So we have to remember that as sysadmins and operations people, we need to be sort of looking to move up the stack ourselves to manage applications better, because our secret knowledge of like which thing to tweak is not as valuable as we think it is. And we need to actually understand what is valuable, which is making applications faster, making them deliver them more quickly, offer a better level of service, offer business and customers things that will actually make them look at us and go, wow, these guys are really helping us, sell widgets or provide services or whatever it is.
That, and if you rely on secret knowledge to make your life happy, that life will involve never going on vacation to the Boundary Waters and canoeing without a cell phone. And that life will also involve a lot of waking up at 4 in the morning. I recommend, not going with that.
I would substitute sitting by the pool in Costa Rica, but okay, you can go with the outdoors.
The pool is probably outdoors. If it's in Costa Rica, I don't think they need to have an indoor pool.
Cocktails with umbrellas in them. I'm pretty sure they
do. It's a win.
Love it. Okay, so let's move into talking about some upcoming community and event stuff.
Yeah.
Angie from Container Camp tweeted earlier, actually, that there's I'm gonna be out in San Francisco on April 17th speaking at Container Camp, and I'll have a discount code, BK15 for a 20% discount. That gave us some fits of confusion until we realized it's 2015. I don't know when that happened. But we also are going to have a couple of free tickets to give away. So anyone who, let's see, we'll pick a winner for today out of everyone who tweets I love at Arrested DevOps and at Container Camp within 2 days of the live broadcast. And then again, we'll pick a second one within 2 days when the episode goes live on iTunes. So there's
That'll be
that.
awesome.
And
Also,
then Matt, you've got one as well.
oh, right. So yeah, so just remember ChefConf will be March 31st through April 2nd in Santa Clara. If you go to chef.io/chefconf, the code ADO will get you a 10% discount. Bridget's speaking, I'm speaking, Trevor's speaking, other people are speaking, but that aren't on the show. So, but yeah, so come, it'll be awesome and fun. And
it should be awesome and fun. We will continue to have pretty much the same CFPs we told you about last time open. A bunch of CFPs closing at the end of February, so you'll want to take a look at your DevOps days and Agile CFPs.
Right. Unless you're listening to this on iTunes or whatever, and then it's too late because it's probably the end of February by the time you heard this. So, sorry. So, Bridget, where are you going to be going on for the next couple weeks if people want to find you?
Let's
offline?
See. Well, if
that sounded creepy.
Well, I mean, hey, this is you kind of get to seriously you get to a point where you're like people are like, let's get together and let's have meal/beverage of your choice, and you're like, excellent, I'll be at these meetups because
I meant as opposed
I have time for that.
I will be at Meyer on Saturday.
Like this is what we have time for, right?
Yep.
So tomorrow night, that would be February 18th. I'll be co-hosting the Minneapolis AWS meetup. Andy Fleener from Sport Engine will be talking about what they're doing with OpsWorks over at SPS Commerce in downtown Minneapolis. February 26th, I'll be doing my best Patrick Dubois impression. I'm going to open the open spaces at the Target internal DevOps days because, hey, Minnesota company, Minnesota proud, right? Right? And then,
sure.
And then Chicago, I'm going to come visit Stratton.
Yep. Yeah, so on March 9th, Bridget will be speaking at the Chicago DevOps meetup talking about Docker. That meetup is already totally full and waitlisted, but try to get on it if you want to be. I was looking at where I'm going to be in the next few weeks. I'll be at that meetup when Bridget's talking about Docker, probably. There's also going to be a Chef/Azure meetup on the March 11th or 12th. I'll put the links in the show notes, so I'll be there. And but probably a lot more interesting places starting in March, starting in ChefConf. So James, what cool things are you going to be doing?
James, because I know that you like other things besides Docker, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about any of them. But like you did an awesome monitoring survey in the last year, so I know you're into monitoring. And I just give us one spoiler. Tell us about something exciting that you learned from your monitoring survey, or something that surprised you about it.
I think more that so there was I was both disappointed and happy with the outcome. I was disappointed that so few developers do monitoring. That made me very sad, and something I'm going to try and work on over the next 12 months and trying to evangelize it to developers about how they can get involved with monitoring. It's not sort of a sysadmin-centric thing. The thing that did make me pleased was that there were quite a large number of people that were actually heading towards sort of monitoring business logic instead of just like CPU and memory disk, which is kind of, it's useful, but it's in the context of the business, it's kind of worthless. So the fact that more and more people were looking at applications and the business as things they should measure was very heartening.
Awesome. So if people want to talk to you about that kind of stuff or about Docker, like where can they find you in the coming months?
In April, I'll be at FluentConf talking about Docker for developers. And in June, I will be at Monitorama in Portland, where I'll be launching the 2015 version of the monitoring survey. Bigger, better, stronger, hopefully not more complicated, because it took me a while to relearn how to use R and maths to process it all. But so I'll be talking about monitoring as a service and how to build a monitoring environment that sort of services your customers. And I'll also be talking about the new monitoring survey and the results of the previous year's monitoring survey.
Awesome. Great, thank you. So let's go into our checkouts. James, what do you got for us? You got something cool to check out?
Yeah. One of the things that I've been reading fairly eagerly at the moment is that early access version of Jason Dixon's Monitoring with Graphite book is I think he's about 4 chapters in. And those of you who are familiar with Graphite, it's an amazing graphing tool, both in terms of collecting metrics and the dashboard that displays them. And it integrates with a lot of other tools, Collectd, Grafana, Influx, DB, all that sort of stuff, really cool. And if you're thinking about looking at monitoring and looking at a more metric-centric monitoring environment, then Jason's book is absolutely awesome. It's available through O'Reilly on early release. If you go to the O'Reilly website and look for search for Graphite or Jason Dixon, you'll find it.
I've read the first 3 chapters of it. I owe him comments on the first 3 chapters of it, but it's really quite good.
Yeah, it's very impressive. It's a huge product, and the topic of graphs and metrics is like non-trivial to cover. So I've been pretty impressed by how elegantly he's done it so far. And I'll put a pitch in as well. I'm also writing a book about monitoring. It's going to be called, very arrogantly, The Art of Monitoring. The website is artofmonitoring.com. And at the moment, you can just sign up for the mailing list and get updates when they get released. But I'm going to be helping people build a new monitoring architecture. So essentially something that isn't that sort of traditional Nagios pull-centric model, but more of a application-centric, business-centric push model, which is sort of focused really on metrics, on events, rather than on checks and hosts.
Awesome. That's super sweet. Okay, so let's see. Since it's checkout/retro, since last time we podcasted, one of the reasons that I wasn't on a recent one was being out of town. I actually spent a week out with my Philly and New York-based Drama Fever coworkers, which was super fun. And I got to go to our 3rd annual Drama Fever Awards show. I mostly thought I was just attending for the after party with, off-key karaoke singing with coworkers, which was super fun. But the actual award show was really neat too, because there were, K-drama stars who came over to the U.S. and were completely jet-lagged and presenting awards to one another. And there was a K-pop band called Surprise, spelled with a 5, all very confusing. And I was telling a friend of mine here in Minneapolis about this, and he said, "Oh, Surprise, the K-pop band. Yes, my 13-year-old, 14-year-old daughter loves them." And I was like, this is something I don't know anything about because I'm old. Excellent. But I got to see them, so I took some video of them. I'll give it to him for his daughter. Give it to Paul when I see him next. That was kind of fun. But then also the other thing I have Docker related for people to check out is the Docker to Doocy Chrome plugin. So some of you may have seen this. Matt did tweet about it before. But it's very much along the same lines as Cloud to Butt. But if you would like to see Michael Ducey all over your Docker pages instead of just the word Docker everywhere, it's very, very funny.
That inflammatory Docker post is hilarious when you have the Docker to Ducey plugin. Ducey's like, this dude has got huge problems with me. I don't know what I ever did to him.
I'm not sure.
Congratulations on 1.0 though.
Docker hype or Juicy hype. I mean, either one makes me feel a little bit nauseous.
Tomato, right? So. Oh, he's gonna punch me. So retro. So last week I was in Portland for the very first time ever, which is crazy because I have family out there. So I was super excited to visit my family. But I was there for Agile Open Northwest, which is an all open spaces Agile conference. That was a lot of fun. I led an open space about improv. I got a tattoo. I met the founder of Voodoo Donuts while winding a clock at OMSI. Such hipster, very, very Portland. And then the other checkouts I have is today I learned about a gem called Kitty, like kitty cat. So if you just type in gem install Kitty, every time you type in Kitty at your prompt, you'll get a little ASCII drawing of a cat to cheer you up. So there's that.
This would help Catherine if she's saying rubby, 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 rubby.
It would. And then you can also export alias Kitty to Kitty if you really want to be cool. I also have finally, even though it's been on for like 2 weeks, but I've finally been home to watch stuff on my DVR, so I'm getting caught up on watching Better Call Saul, which is the spinoff from Breaking Bad. It's like the prequel to Breaking Bad. It's awesome if you... Actually, I think it would be awesome even if you didn't watch Breaking Bad, but I had high expectations, and they have been met so far, so huzzah. So anyway, speaking of huzzaing, we have a newsletter. You can sign up for it at arresteddevops.com/bananastand. It's the best way to know about our upcoming podcast episodes and cool news with DevOps. We've been sending it out regularly, twice a month, like for reals now.
Ever since I gave you shit about it and asked if we should remove that we have a newsletter because I didn't think we actually did.
That's right. We totally do. And it's awesome. I'm so excited. So I want to give big thanks to Mandy Moore. You can find her on Twitter at @TheRubyRep or at devreps.com. She helps us out with all of our post-production of the show. She's the best in the business for helping out software professionals from anything to administration, to research, to event organization, to podcast production. Check her out and the rest of her company services at devreps.com.
Thanks to our sponsors.
DevOps.
Please be sure to visit them at arresteddevops.com/VictorOps and arresteddevops.com/Datadog31. Thank you so much, James, for joining us today. This is super fun having you.
No, it was awesome to be here. I apologize if I got too ranty in parts.
No, if anything, not ranty enough.
Exactly the right amount of Australian ranty.
Exactly.
I think it was only 5 or 6 expletives, so it was a quiet night.
I think I probably swore just about as much as you did. And to our loyal listeners, if you enjoy Arrested DevOps, we'd appreciate it if you'd visit arresteddevops.com/iTunes and leave us a review in the iTunes store. No matter what you have to say, we'd love to get your feedback.
You can check us out at arresteddevops.com on the interwebs, at arresteddevops on Twitter. We're on the Facebooks. We're always happy to get your input, ideas, or feedback at shows@arresteddevops.com. Please let us know any ideas you have for future episodes. I'm Matt at Matt Stratton.
And I'm Bridget at Bridget Kremhout. We're Arrested DevOps, and remember,
there's always DevOps in the banana stand.